going to the Pharaoh and saying to him, going to Ramses II and said, let my people go, that's not recorded anywhere else but in the book of Exodus. If a whole army, like they say that the Pharaoh's army died in the Red Sea, a whole army in the most powerful nation on the earth at that time had been drowned, it would have been carved in stele all over the literate world at that time. Persia was literate, India was literate, Babylon was literate. All of those were literate nations. It would have been written in all those nations. The Greeks at that time were not literate. There was no Rome at that time. You know, there was no Greece actually at that time. No European nation. There was no European nation. It was only tribes. None of them were literate at the time. But in every literate nation would have recorded something as significant as a whole army of the greatest ruler in the world, the ruler of Kemet, drowning in the Red Sea. If 3 million people had walked up to the Red Sea and Moses lifted up his staff and it parted, you would see that carved in stone there today. That's an awesome and a magnificent thing that would not have been unnoted. It is only recorded in one place, in the book of Exodus. Just like the enslavement of the Hebrews is only recorded in the book of Exodus. Throughout the whole history, Dr. Sheikh Anta Diop tells us, of Kemet, which the Bible calls Egypt, there were no more than 30,000 slaves. And they were people, mostly Eurasians, who had landed and did not act right. So they were made to work and pay for the wrong they had done. Instead of throwing them in jail, they put them to work. They made slaves out of them, servants. But there were not more than 30,000 throughout the whole history of the Khmeran Empire, which might have been as old as 18,000 years when you go back, if you put it at the founding of agriculture, which the story says Osar and Osset founded in the Nile Valley at the founding of agriculture, which dates back 18,000 BCE. Now, Egypt did not exist off of a feudal system, and you have to have a feudal system for slavery to go. They were not like the Romans or the Greeks. They didn't depend on slavery for their labor. The pyramids were not built by slave labor. They were built by contract, and they got records of the contracts there. This was contracted work. People built it and enjoyed building it. They built it while the Nile was inundated because they couldn't plant at that time, so they did something else. They built pyramids. But there were no slaves. Certainly no Hebrews built them. The pyramids were built so much longer before Abraham came. The Great Pyramid of Giza could be, it's at least 7,000 years old. By the time Abraham got there, it was about 4,000 years old. So it wasn't but a few people with him, so they couldn't have built it. When Moses' people come on the scene, or were there, it's about 1,200 years. So they didn't build anything there. They were not enslaved there. Now, it could have been possible that this in the book of Exodus gives it a key, said we have to do something about their birth rate because they may join our enemy when they come. Because the Hebrews, even though they were Africans, were known to be wishy-washy. They were with the Africans if the African was in power, but if the Asian came in, they joined the Asian. So they would go betwixt and between. They were not black people you could depend on. They only went for themselves, and they were very small people. But this is before they become a nation now. They're down there. They're not even a nation. They're still loosely scattered tribes of descendants of 12 sons of Jacob. And then Moses, for whatever reason, leads them out of there. They're going into Palestine. They get into Palestine, Moses dies, Joshua commits genocide against the people at the city of Jericho. That's genocide. They take land from another black people, the Canaanites. They take it. They take it in the name of their God. Say, God sent me to take this land from you. That's genocide. That's an act of genocide. There's no way you can justify it whatsoever. They say, well, we took it because you're heathen. The Hebrews bowed down to other gods. Even Abraham, when he wanted Sarah to get pregnant, she didn't get pregnant, he went and got him a teraphim and put it under his pillow as a symbol to the great goddess of the universe to make his wife pregnant. So he was still into that. Moses, when the children of Israel were in the desert and were bitten by the serpents, he didn't tell them to go pray to God. He put a brazen serpent, if you remember the story, up on a pole and told them that everybody that looks up to this will be healed. That's a form of idolatry. That's a form of imaging. So now when the Hebrews accused everybody else of being heathens, they were doing the same practices. They did it throughout Israel. They were not as significant as a nation in the days of Moses, even in the days of Joshua. They spilled, after Joshua took them into the land of Canaan, they spent another 200 to 400 years, we're not sure on what the period is, probably 200 years, with intertribal battles. You read the book of Judges. And they're constantly killing one another. If when one of the other surrounding Canaanite nations doesn't come in, the Jebusites and Amalekites, and subdue them, and they constantly have to get liberators to get them from up under them. They do not become a nation until about 1000. This is over 200 years after Moses leads them out. To about 1000 BCE. In the days of King Saul, they get a king, but they're not an actual nation. It is in the days of David that they begin to take some form of nationhood. And it is in the days of David that they start to exterminate the indigenous people there in Palestine, known as the Canaanites. They begin to exterminate them. The Bible even says that according to their story, God commanded David to go down and kill everything that pisses against the wall. That's in the Bible. That's, I believe, in 1st or 2nd Samuel. 2nd Samuel. Man, woman, child, and cattle. Kill them all. That's how crude it was. That's how awful and horrifying it was. St. Augustine, one of the founders of the African Christian church, said, if you believe the book of Genesis and the Old Testament, and you take it literally, you are attributing to God things unworthy of him. Because those acts were acts of human beings and their atrocities against one another. These were black people hurting black people. Wasn't even no white folks in it at that time. White folks weren't strong enough to do any real invading of the land at that time. They were hitting on the outskirts of things, but they weren't able to kick up any dust at that time. The Scythians had been beat back up into Europe, so they didn't have the strength to do it. So now they become a nation around 1000 BCE, but nobody even cares about them, nobody recognizes them to this one period that is outstanding in their whole history. And that is the period when Solomon is king. And Dr. Sheikh Anta Diop said it, and that is the only time that Israel is recognized in world history. And the reason why Solomon, who was about 960, he comes on the throne, and he reigns according to Kings, the book of Kings, he reigns for 40 years. The reason why Solomon has such prominence in the world and makes Israel prominent is because of world trade, and also the women he married. Most of the women among his wives were out of Africa and from African nations.
Well, let's talk about Solomon in terms of, was he an African? What at that time?
He, in all probability, was an African because the Hebrews were Africoids. They were dark-skinned people. They were black people. Let's face it. They were Kemetans and Cushites. They were all mixed up. And then they were mixed up with Canaanites. So they were black people.